How do you solve a problem like the storm wall? Well, Stonewielder, of course. Let's review Ian C. Esslemont's book, Stonewielder. Stonewielder by Ian C. Esslemont is his third novels of the Malazan Empire. If you don't know, the Malazan world was created around a gaming group, and two members of that gaming group that I think is decades long spanning have published books in that world. The most known is probably Steven Erikson with his Malazan Book of the Fallen, and Ian C. Esslemont, who has written a series that are called the Novels of the Malazan Empire. Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson and these Novels of the Malazan Empire will share characters at certain points, but are different series with different thrusts and different themes. I have not had a lot of exposure to Esslemont. This is only the third book I've read, so I'm excited to review it with you today. So this review will be broken down into a spoiler-free and spoiler-filled section. In my spoiler-free section, I'll be going over broadly the plot and the characters as it pertains to the actual story itself. Part of the reason for this is that if you're like me and it's been a while since you read the last novel of the Malazan world, Return of the Crimson Guard, you may need a refresher. I certainly did, and so hopefully this video can help in that respect. And also, maybe if you sort of fell off after Return of the Crimson Guard and need an oomph to get back into the novels of the Malazan world, I'm hoping that the spoiler-free section will do that for you, because I really enjoyed this book. Spoiler-filled section obviously will be going over more broad themes, and I also will have a section in there talking about Esslemont versus Erikson and their writing styles and why I might prefer one over the other. Without further ado, let's get into what is Stonewielder actually about. Most simply, this book is about the Malazan Empire trying to take over a different subcontinent than ones that we have seen in previous Malazan books, and that is the continent of Fist, or Coral. So this is not on Genebacus, where Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Isis. This is not in Seven Cities, which is where Dead House Gates and most of House of Chains. This is in a separate area of the world. And this particular conquest by the Malazan Empire is quite interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is the second time that they have attempted to take over this subcontinent, and the person who led the forces the first time that was mostly a failure is Greymane, a character that we have met and spent a lot of time with in Return of the Crimson Guard, the last novel of the Malazan Empire. Spoiler alert, he's going to get probably a second chance. Secondly, and this is really the heart and theme of the whole book, is that this whole continent is dominated by a single religious ideology around the cult of the Lady. That's all we know about this religion, is it is called the Lady, and she is incredibly powerful. There is complete domination by this cult, both politically, militarily, socially, culturally, across the entire continent. There's a lot of different empires or cities or countries, city-states, but all of them fall into a larger belief system or a larger network that is centered on this religious idea of the Lady. And as it pertains to the Malazan conquest, the Lady is an extremely powerful force that makes it impossible for any mages to access their warrens. So magic is very, very difficult, which is one of the reasons why the first Malazan sort of thrust into this subcontinent failed. One of the reasons for this cult's complete dominance on this subcontinent is fear over a group of people that we don't know much about that are just called the Storm Riders. And this is a mythical people who live in the ocean, it seems, but they want to migrate into this subcontinent. We don't really know much about this, but we know that for some reason they want to migrate. Well, so the Storm Riders, I should say a little more about them because they're a pretty cool part of this book. They literally, as it sounds like, live in the waves. All that we really see are huge waves from the ocean of storms that come towards the subcontinent, and there's flashing lights inside of them and humanoid-like figures within those lights. And those are the Storm Riders. And fear over this group and what they want to do has given the Lady immense power. And it is most centralized in something called the Storm Wall, which is, just like it sounds, this huge, almost Great Wall-like facade that keeps out the Storm Riders, doesn't allow them to migrate across the nation or the subcontinent. And that is armed by a group of religious extremists who are also very powerful militarily, called the Storm Guard. And so the whole book, Stonewielder, is about, can the Malazans overcome both all of the actual military risk of going on this island, the naval struggles, because they don't quite have naval superiority on this subcontinent, and perhaps more importantly, the magical or godlike elements of the lady and the cult around it. It sounds pretty cool. And for the most part, it really is. And I think interestingly about that push and pull, like I might have made it sound like the lady and the cult of the lady are the bad guys. But of course, our main quote unquote good guys are the imperial soldiers, right? This colonizing imperial empire of the Malazans, which also isn't great. And so as in most Malazan books, there's not necessarily good and bad, although some characters are quite reprehensible and even, some are more heroic, but there is not a clear moral high ground that anyone is standing on in this book, which is one thing I quite enjoy, and I'm glad I enjoy across all Malazan books, and I'm glad is here in this version. All right, so let's go over the sort of broad main characters in this book. So I think that will help also sort of understand what this book is about. Like any Malazan book I've read, there are a lot of different viewpoints, and they are all over the conflict on both sides and within sides on different factions. And that's part of the beauty of Malazan storytelling. So we get three main first viewpoints in the actual Malazan army that is invading. That is, of course, Greymane / Kyle. We have been following since Return of the Crimson Guard and are now brought into this new army. A cadre mage that may be a little bit more powerful called Davalith, which is quite interesting because she is actually a member of one of the countries on the subcontinent that has now joined the Malazans to help them break the supremacy of the lady on this subcontinent, which is very interesting. And then, as all good Malazan books have, we also have a viewpoint kind of at the squad level of everything that's happening. And our main POV there is Sooth, who I think is great and hilarious and provides a lot of heart and really good point of view during action sequences. We have the perspective of the high mage of the other side, the sort of subcontinent forces, Usu, who is struggling because he can't access his warren and is trying to manipulate the lady so that he can use his warren. Quite an interesting viewpoint there. We have a perspective on one specific city with a high assessor, which is sort of a judicial opinion by the name of Bakuna. And this viewpoint is very interesting because he's uncovering some of the evil that is done in this larger religious cult of the lady, but not as a Malazan invader, as a native of this country who is finding out some things that are quite unsavory that is happening in this particular country. Around his storyline is also someone called Ibshank, I think is how I said that, who is an ex-priest of Fenir, who is also fighting this religious fanaticism, even as someone who was religiously affiliated before. There's like another sort of natural organic revolution that is happening in another area. Ivanar, is how I say that, is the viewpoint we get there, who is like this gladiator who becomes wrapped up in what's called the Army of the Reform movement, which is also questioning a lot of the religious ideals that they have been taught for a long time. And then we have a lot of viewpoints at the actual storm wall itself. As I said, that's a key part of this story. We get viewpoints from the actual storm guard themselves, people who man the wall and are like magically connected to the lady. They're devoted to the lady. Hayam is the main sort of Lord Protector. I don't know if that's his exact title, that we see a lot from there. And then we also have the viewpoint of the people who are actually fighting the Storm Riders as they come against the wall, because the Storm Guard take prisoners. And some of these prisoners are members of the Crimson Guard from previous books that we have heard, particularly Bars and Corlo. And then there's another band of sort of roving Crimson Guard members who are trying to find Bars and Corlo and other people who are at the wall to help them. And so this is Blues, Shell, Lazar, and Fingers. And that's most of our viewpoints. Obviously, there's other smaller ones, but those are sort of the broad views we get of this conflict. As it probably sounds, I really enjoyed this read, while not finding it top-notch Malazan, which I consider the Book of the Fallen is still sort of the gold standard in this world. There's a lot of really rich, fun Malazan lore. I really, really like the storm wall and all of the things that go on there. There's some really cool connections to the Malazan Book of the Fallen, as well as some of the other books that Esslemont has written. Some cool cameos, surprise twists. The theme is strong once you sort of reflect on it, and I'll talk a lot more about that in my spoiler-filled section of religious ideology, what that means for a culture and a group of people, especially religious purity, sort of anti-religious pluralism, that this particular thing is right and must be right, and how that destroys sort of a larger culture and discussion amongst peoples. But it isn't quite executed as much as I would like, to be quite frank. And I have found Esslemont's writings at point to be quite choppy and somewhat distracting from the story. And it's hard to just sit down and read large swaths of this book at one point for me as a reader. But all that to say is that this is absolutely my favorite novel of the Malazan Empire. I am gladly going to give Ian C. Esslemont's Stonewielder a long endorsement. And I would add on that if you are reading Malazan, Book of the Fallen, and you really like it and you're hesitant about jumping into some of the side stuff, this is worth it. I think Knight of Knives is worth it. I didn't love Return of the Crimson Guard. Maybe you can read the Malazan wiki to kind of catch up and then jump into Stonewielder, or just know that if you go through Return of the Crimson Guard, it's not your favorite. There's greener grass on the other side, and it's definitely worth it if you are a Malazan fan. Also, just shout out here before we do spoiler-filled stuff. Thank you so much, all the people who work on the Malazan Wiki. As someone who is jumping in after a long time being away from the novels of the Malazan Empire, it was extremely helpful to go to Greymane's page and see everything and remember what happened in Crimson Guard. Same with Kyle. A couple other things, what's happening with this sword and that other sword. And I'm just so thankful that those resources exist in this day, and I got to take advantage of it, and it really helped my reading experience of this book. So thank you. And with that, let's get to a spoiler-filled discussion of this book. Spoilers. All right, so let's say the main thing here out front. The storm wall, everything connected with it, is so cool. That is the perfect encapsulation, I think, of what Malazan is, can be, should be. This cool concept, just visually, a huge wall, miles wide, on the coast that is not defending against an oncoming fleet of ships, but is actually against the waves themselves that are magically attacking the wall with translucent flashes of light inside that are actually humanoids that are trying to destroy the wall. And actually they come, they're coming because everything gets cold and it's frost, freezing cold, and the storm guard have to try to hold them back by using this religious magic, and they take captives and they just have to man the wall. And they've been doing it for hundreds of years. That is impressive and great. But it's not just the visuals that Malazan is interested in. They have great visuals and great ideas, but thematically, it is so rich, especially in this world. I'm recording this in 2025. There is incredible fear throughout the world about migration, particularly in the western and northern parts of our globe. People are having to get away from conflicts, get away from a changing climate, and it is causing these tensions all throughout the world. And people are just afraid of things they don't understand coming into their homelands. And that really is what the storm wall is. In fact, many people fantasize about walls being built to keep people out of countries where they currently live, because those people coming in, they perceive will ruin their lives. They will take things from them. And that's exactly what the Storm Guard are thinking. And that a lot of that thinking is religious based, and not just belief. This book is not anti-religion or anti-belief. In fact, in many ways, it is pro these things and shows through many different characters, specifically the Ivanar character, how that meaning can really bring important things to people's lives. But this religious purity and anti-religious pluralism that the Cult of the Lady recognizes brings about these evils. And even though you're keeping off the people that you fear, and we're never told why they really fear the Storm Guard, but they do fear them, it allows this cult to basically take total control, and that allows for lots of other bad things. The Bakuna character, I think, is so interesting, uncovering basically that in the midst of this cult, there's a lot of very questionable things done with children. And it's never explicitly stated if that's like sexual abuse, if that is just like human sacrifice, but whatever it is, it's bad. But it's being done in the name of religion, and so everyone looks the other way, or the powers that be let it happen, which there's a lot of parallels in our own world where that happens. Because if people know bad things are happening in the church, then they will think worse of the church. The reputation of the church is harmed, and so they sort of bury things under the rug, which means that more of those bad things happen to different children and families. And so like the perpetuation of like, if we have to protect this religious belief at all costs, it hurts way more people than if we were honest with the abuses that happen in that moment. And so I think that's why the High Assessor is such an important storyline to this whole thing. And I want to hammer down on that because I don't think Esslemont is as clear with his themes as I would quite want him to, but it's definitely there when you start looking at the text closer, that this sort of anti-religious, maybe not monotheism, but like mono-religious idea that there can be this one particular belief set and everything else we have to destroy is emphasized quite a bit as being bad. So in a epigraph at the beginning of chapter 5, we hear this quote. This is on 218 in my book. "And so the people came to the land promised and set aside for them by the Blessed Lady from time immemorial. And they found it empty, virgin, and unspoiled, for the wild peoples who lived like animals upon it and knew not her name. And so the people brought to these wild folk her name with flame and with sword, and they were enlightened." So there's a very heavy quote and history that is laden with a lot of biblical language or holy book language that we are recognized from our world, while also reflecting a lot of things that happened in the like North American, African, South American continents of colonialism in the name of like civilizing cultures, brutalizing them, killing them, enslaving them, horrible things that are done, and that there is a religious aspect to this. I mean, a whole big part of the United States expansion was manifest destiny, that God has given us this world, and so we must go and populate it, which comes a reflection from the Bible, a certain interpretation of the Bible and aspects in the Old Testament. So like, this is very, very heavy with themes from our own world here. And that is opposed to, I like this one throwaway line, this is in 270, where a martyr has just been killed in the name of the lady and was super excited about it. And this person says, "He wanted to be a martyr to the lady. They all want to die for her. It is perverse. Shouldn't faith seek life?" And that's what I'm talking about. This book's not anti-faith. It's anti-faith that doesn't view life as worthwhile, that it should be preserved, that it should be loved and taken care of. And that is actually a higher ideal than the faith or the tenets of that faith itself. And I think that's a really beautiful picture here. Another really interesting quote is from Davaleth, who remember is like a mage from another land and helping the Malazans. And so one of the main characters is asking like, why are you helping? And she says, "Having all you know or have ever been taught overturned as a deep pit of lies is a humbling experience. It is no wonder no one is allowed to travel from our homelands. We are told it was because ours was the happiest and richest of all lands, and that anyone leaving would return to corrupt it with inferior ideologies and ways." And I suppose that's true, at least half of it. I wish we actually had more of Davaleth's story, but obviously she is recognizing that the religion that has taken root in her culture is harmful. And that if you the reason that they don't allow other things into their religion is because, or their nation, their social structure is because these other ideas are better. They seek life more than the cult of the lady, which is oppressing so many people. It's just so powerful, and especially at the end when we find out that the lady is basically all the stuff that has been done the last 100 years to her has been blood sacrifice to continue to make her stronger. And just another reflection that all of this is really done just so the powerful can be more powerful and enjoy their power more, while the people who actually believe this faith or are involved in this church get hurt or others get hurt, and destruction is tantamount. And that's like the key, I think, of this work is that Esslemont is trying to get at, is the harm of not being pluralistic with our religious viewpoints in our world, and that it really shuts off what should be a very important part of human existence. Other Malazan lore that I thought was quite good in this book that I liked sort of the end of Greymane. I actually felt like it faded a little bit towards the end. I wish there was more, but when he says, there's a price to pay, and it needs to be paid, speaking about himself and also the nations and really everything around this culture, I found quite moving, but also not as moving as it could be, especially a character that I've been with for so long in these books. I actually really grew to like the character of Kyle. He doesn't have much to do in this book, but to kind of just be around. But as usual, I really like when we're in Sooth's perspective and he is looking at the adjunct who is Kyle and a character I know and his impressions of that character. And normally in those viewpoints, people are so impressed by the adjunct or Kyle, and he's mysterious and he's powerful. But I know the inner workings of Kyle, which is so interesting. This is also a trick that Erikson pulls off all the time with Captain Perrin, a couple other characters where I know the internal workings of them and they're not as cool as these people think they are or their viewpoint of them, but it's great to see those viewpoints of people respecting characters that I respect, even though they know less about them. I think that's great. Speaking of Sooth, I think that that whole squad really is pulled off quite well, and during the fighting is great. And Sooth is very fun about this person who wants to prove himself as a warrior, and by the end he just wants to basically help preserve the soldiers around him and be a good soldier. I thought was really, really good. I think the character of Pike is quite interesting, who's on that squad, but is really a scoundrel and a terrible person, and reminds us again that the Malazans are not just a good force. Many of this invading stuff is going to lead to abuses. In fact, earlier in the book, where a small business is basically pressured to give money for protection to the Malazan guards in this nation, and with the character of Pike, you're always reminded that, if a certain mindset takes place, these soldiers are going to abuse their power over these conquered people. So it's just this reminder that there's not a clear right and wrong moral ground in this particular conflict. Love Leomin and Kiska. I think that is interesting. Them just going through the Realm of Shadow, and they have a little run-in with the Tis Leomin. That's, there's not really much to do in that storyline, but I like that it's continuing it. I'm excited to see where it goes, because Tyshreen, I think, is an interesting character, and Kiska being connected to him and finding out what actually happened to him. I'm quite interested in seeing that being worked out in future novels of the Malazan Empire. So finally, I want to talk a little bit, now that I've read 3 Esslemonts, compare his writing to Erikson, because I certainly prefer Erikson. I mean, that's an understatement. Stephen Erikson is probably my favorite author currently living, and is one of the greatest authors of his generation. And Esslemont is a good writer, but it's hard that your other co-creator is one of the best writers of all time, for you not to be compared to that. And so this is an unfair comparison, and Esslemont has written some really good fantasy books, but I wanted to kind of give at least some reasons why I think that. I think the main overall thing, honestly, is just that the themes, and I've mentioned it a couple times, are just never as strong, as moving as they are with Erikson. That might surprise people, because I've just talked for, I don't know how long, 10 minutes about the strong theme of this book. But a lot of that was upon reflection rather than in the writing. And I think the idea could have been expanded upon more. I mentioned this in my spoiler-free section, but I also think just page to page, as you are reading Esslemont, it is just not as smooth and as dynamic as Erikson is. Everything from the dialogue that is being said to the internal sort of thought matrix of the main characters, creativity, descriptions of events, having a grasp of actually what is happening. I just think Esslemont is just a little behind Erikson in each of these categories. And that over the course of a 500, 600 page book, I think does wear on me a bit. I also think the writing is a bit uneven from a character perspective and interest in those characters. As I mentioned, Greymane is sort of interesting in the middle, but also gets a little, not boring, but repetitive, or just, it didn't grab me as much. I mentioned I like Kiska and Leomin's journey, but there's not really much happening. So sometimes I got to get through this section. Same with the Crimson Guard, actually. Very interestingly, at the beginning, Shell and their sort of movement was kind of a drag on. I was like, oh, I have to get through this again. By the end, it was quite good. This inconsistency I find difficult in these novels of the Malazan Empire to view them on the same sort of stage of goodness as the Book of the Fallen. But every once in a while, there are characters that work really well. And in fact, the one that I think works best with like the economy of storytelling and also opening and closing the book is High Fist Realish, who I didn't talk about a lot on this review because he's not super consequential to the story, but is this heart of like he had to leave his family to help in this again. And he's not looking for advancement or glory. He just wants to do a good job, get his old properties back for his family. And then at the end, the last scene that he gets to come home to his family is a wonderful ending. And Esslemont really, really pulls that off from start to finish. And I wish more of the storylines did that. Not a lot of them are start to finish, 2 thumbs up. So overall, I liked it, didn't love it. Malazan lore is pretty great, pretty interesting, especially the storm wall I think is great. I think it's really interesting that the lady ends up being another part of the crippled god, which ties in so well with obviously the Book of the Fallen and where that is going. I am more excited than I have been to continue in the novels of the Malazan world. The next one is, I think, Orb, Scepter, Throne, which I have here. And after a quick palate cleanse, I'm going to jump right back in. I'm excited to see what happens with Kyle, although since he's going to a sale, that might be a little while until we get back to there. But I really want to find out what happened with Teshrine and Kiska and Leomin and where that goes. It's also worth saying that a lot of this took place in about 550 pages, which is a pretty short in the Malazan world book. Oh, I guess it's 600. Okay, going up to 600. But like that's for a fantasy reader and especially for a Malazan reader, that's pretty digestible. And I think that's impressive. And Esslemont needs to be encouraged and praised for that. What did you think of Stonewielder? I know the only people watching at this point are huge Malazan heads. So let's talk in the comments below. Please don't spoil future Esslemont books, but I want to talk in detail about this book. Get in my comments. Also, please like, subscribe, and especially share this if you're a part of like Malazan reading groups or Facebook groups or like Reddits or whatever. Share this video because this is obviously made for the Malazan community. Those are the people that want to talk about the third novel of the Malazan world. I'm excited to be there with you. So as always, first in, last out.